John had always been quiet. He was the kind of person who moved through life without drawing much attention to himself. At the small company where he worked, he was often overlooked, and most of his colleagues didn't really notice him beyond the occasional nod in the hallway or a polite, "Good morning." John didn't mind. He preferred it that way. There was a kind of peace in being unnoticed, a freedom that allowed him to focus on the things that mattered most to him. He wasn't flashy. He wore simple clothes, nothing trendy or expensive, and his old shoes were more about comfort than style. People sometimes whispered about him behind his back. "He dresses like he just came from the thrift store," they would say, laughing quietly. Some of his colleagues made jokes, thinking he couldn't possibly be serious about life, finance, or even work. But John never reacted. He didn't need their approval or validation. He had his own goals, and he was quietly working toward them. At work, John was dependable. He always arrived on time, completed tasks before deadlines, and never complained. Even when others grumbled about small problems, meetings were a different story. When John spoke up, his ideas were often ignored or brushed aside. People were too busy showing off their own knowledge. Or they assumed that because John was quiet, he didn't have much to contribute. Sometimes, John would feel a pang of frustration, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he listened carefully, learned from every situation, and took note of what worked and what didn't. Outside the office, John's life was equally simple. He didn't go out every weekend or spend hours on social media comparing himself to others. He liked reading books, walking in the park, and cooking his own meals. Friends would sometimes invite him to expensive dinners or nights out, and he would politely decline. "I have plans," he'd say, knowing that his plans were usually quiet evenings spent budgeting, saving, and thinking about his future. People laughed at his frugality. "How can someone live like that?" they would ask. But John didn't see it as a sacrifice. He saw it as an investment in the life he wanted to build. Money was important to John, but not in the way it seemed to matter to others. He didn't care about flashy cars, brand name clothes, or showing off wealth. For him, money was a tool, a way to create security and freedom. Every month, he carefully tracked his expenses, saving a portion of his salary before even thinking about spending. He invested wisely, researching small, steady opportunities that most people overlooked. John's life was quiet, disciplined, and controlled. But it was also full of purpose. At the office, there were always those who enjoyed flaunting what they had. Colleagues would talk about their new gadgets, their expensive vacations, or the luxury items they had bought recently. They laughed loudly, poking fun at anyone who didn't follow the same path. John often heard them, but he never joined in. He knew that true success didn't come from appearances or popularity. It came from patience, knowledge, and consistent effort. While others spent money to impress, John quietly let his wealth grow. People sometimes underestimated him in ways that were frustrating but also amusing. One day, during a meeting, the topic of personal finance came up. Colleagues were boasting about their big purchases, investments, and spending habits. Someone casually asked John what he had been working on. He replied calmly, giving a few simple details about his careful approach to saving and investing. The room erupted in laughter. "John, that's hilarious," someone said. "You don't even have a fancy phone. How could you possibly know about money?" John smiled politely but said nothing more. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone yet. His quiet demeanor made some people curious, though. There were a few who noticed that John seemed calmer, more focused, and strangely confident despite having nothing flashy to show. They would ask him questions, and he would answer honestly, explaining his strategies in simple, clear terms. Most of the office ignored it, laughing at his simplicity. They assumed that because he wasn't loud or flashy, he wasn't successful. They were wrong, but they didn't know it yet. John's life outside work mirrored his approach inside the office. He lived in a modest apartment, furnished simply with everything in its place. There were no expensive gadgets or decorations, just the essentials. But everything he had was maintained with care. His books were organized, his kitchen spotless, and his little balcony garden was thriving with herbs and flowers. John took pride in small achievements, knowing that true value was often hidden in ordinary things. People who visited his apartment sometimes commented on how plain it looked, but he didn't mind. He didn't need anyone's approval to feel satisfied. Even his friendships were different from most people's. John didn't chase popularity or drama. He preferred a few close friends who understood him, appreciated his honesty, and shared similar values. They would spend hours talking about life, goals, and the kind of future they wanted to build. John's friends knew him as someone reliable, wise, and deeply caring. They respected him, even if others didn't notice his worth. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, John sat on his small balcony with a cup of tea. He watched the city lights flicker in the distance and reflected on his life. He thought about the office, the people who laughed at him, and the quiet satisfaction he felt, knowing he was on the right path. While others chased short-term pleasures, John focused on the long term. Every decision, no matter how small, was a step toward the life he envisioned. He smiled, feeling content. The laughter of others didn't matter. What mattered was the knowledge that one day, his quiet efforts would speak louder than any joke or insult. John's discipline extended to every aspect of his life. He exercised regularly, not to show off a perfect body, but to stay healthy and energized. He ate simple, nutritious meals, avoiding unnecessary indulgences. He read books on personal growth, investing, and psychology, constantly learning and improving himself. Others might have mocked his simplicity, but John understood the power of patience and self-control. He knew that these small, consistent actions would eventually create something remarkable, even at work. John's approach started to show subtle results, though few noticed. Projects he managed quietly exceeded expectations. Deadlines were met with ease, and his ideas, when finally implemented, often led to noticeable improvements. Some colleagues began to whisper among themselves, wondering why John's work was so effective. But the louder voices, the ones who loved to laugh and joke, continued to ignore him. They were too busy seeking attention and validation from others. John's secret wasn't really a secret. It was simply consistency. He didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't seek approval or recognition. He simply did what he believed was right, day after day, month after month. And while others wasted energy on appearances, John invested his time, money, and effort in ways that would last. He didn't brag, he didn't complain, and he didn't rush. He understood that the most powerful successes often come quietly, without fanfare, until the moment they cannot be ignored. One morning, as John walked into the office, he overheard a group of colleagues laughing about a new gadget someone had bought. They mocked anyone who didn't have the latest technology, joking about John's old phone and simple lifestyle. He smiled to himself. Their laughter didn't sting. It barely registered. John knew that their focus on superficial things would never give them the same security and freedom he was building. He kept walking, greeting everyone politely, and sat down at his desk. The day began like any other, but in the quiet corners of the office. John's story was slowly unfolding, unnoticed by most, but quietly shaping the future. By the time lunch break came, John had already completed several tasks that others would struggle to finish all day. Some colleagues looked at him with mild surprise, wondering how he could be so efficient. John simply shrugged, poured himself a cup of coffee, and opened his notebook. He had plans, goals, and calculations for his savings and investments. While others spent their breaks talking, laughing, or scrolling through social media, John was quietly preparing for the life he wanted. He didn't need anyone's approval to validate his choices. He knew that one day, the results would speak for themselves. As the first part of John's story unfolded, it became clear that he was more than the quiet, overlooked man everyone laughed at. Beneath the simple clothes, modest apartment, and calm demeanor, there was a person of remarkable discipline, vision, and patience. The seeds of his future success were already planted, even if no one in the office noticed. And John didn't mind, because he knew that life often rewards those who work steadily and wisely, even if the world laughs at them along the way. And so, John continued his days in quiet focus. listening to the laughter around him, but never letting it sway him. Every paycheck, every small saving, every careful decision was a step toward something bigger. Little did his colleagues know, the man they laughed at the most would one day teach them an unforgettable lesson about patience, discipline, and the real meaning of success. A few months after John had quietly settled into his routine, the company announced something unusual. It was meant to be fun, a little competition among the employees, and most of them treated it as a joke. The management had decided to introduce a savings and investment challenge, encouraging everyone to see who could grow their money the most in a year. At first, people laughed when they heard about it. "Who cares about savings?" one colleague said, smirking. "We should make it about vacations or gadgets instead." But management was serious. They wanted to inspire smart financial habits, and the competition was going to be tracked openly. With everyone eventually showing their results, as soon as the announcement was made, the office was buzzing. People whispered, laughed, and made sarcastic comments. Many employees immediately started bragging about their plans. Some said they were going to invest in trendy stocks, while others talked about higher risk, high return schemes. They wanted attention. They wanted to seem smart, confident, and daring. John, of course, did not react. He listened quietly, noting the excitement, the assumptions, and the bravado. He knew most of their plans were shallow and impulsive, made more to impress others than to truly succeed. John decided to participate, but in his own way. He didn't announce it loudly, didn't boast about his strategy, and didn't try to impress anyone. He simply took out his carefully maintained notebook and started making a plan. He reviewed his savings, calculated potential investments, and set realistic, achievable goals. While others were busy imagining instant success and showing off, John focused on steady growth. He knew that patience and discipline would give him a far better outcome than flashy gestures and loud claims, almost immediately. His colleagues noticed that John wasn't sharing his plans. Some found it strange. "Does he even know what he's doing?" one person whispered. "He's probably just going to fail quietly like usual." Others shrugged and went back to their own boasting. John didn't care about their doubts. He had learned long ago that the world often misunderstands quiet determination, and that was fine. He wasn't in the competition to prove anyone wrong. He was in it to improve himself. John's daily routine didn't change much, except now he included the competition in his calculations. Every month, he put aside a portion of his salary for investments, carefully analyzing options that offered steady, long-term growth. He avoided risky trends and scams that tempted others in the office. When someone came to him with a question or tip about a hot stock, he listened politely, but only acted if it matched his careful strategy. This was the difference between John and his colleagues. He valued logic over hype, patience over excitement. Meanwhile, the office was alive with chatter. Some employees bragged daily about their supposed progress, posting charts, talking about recent gains, and poking fun at those who were quiet. John, however, quietly recorded his results in his notebook, noting each change, each increase, each careful decision. By the time his colleagues were showing off, John's numbers were growing steadily, almost invisibly. People laughed at the small gains he made. "You call that progress?" they would joke. But John smiled silently. He knew that small, consistent steps often lead to the biggest results over time. The weeks passed. The competition became a source of entertainment for the office. Lunch breaks were full of discussions about who had invested the most, who spent the most, and who looked the most impressive. John's name rarely came up. People assumed he had nothing to show, that his quiet nature meant he wasn't ambitious. Even some who were genuinely curious avoided asking him, thinking he would give a boring answer. But John didn't mind. He had learned long ago that attention and approval from others were not measures of success. At home, John continued his disciplined routine. Every evening, he reviewed his accounts, compared them to his goals, and planned the next day's strategy. His apartment, always tidy and simple, became a place of reflection and calculation. Unlike his colleagues, who were constantly distracted by social media, trends or showing off, John focused on the fundamentals. He kept his mind clear and his purpose strong. He knew that real success often went unnoticed until the moment it could not be ignored. John's approach soon began to show subtle results. Small gains turned into slightly larger ones, and his careful investments started compounding steadily. Meanwhile, many of his colleagues began to encounter problems. The flashy stocks they had chosen lost value, risky investments failed, and the constant need to impress distracted them from smart decision-making. Some laughed at John's modest progress, but they had no idea that he was quietly building a strong, stable foundation that would surpass them all. The office, full of chatter and noise, rarely paused to notice John's calm efficiency. People laughed at him for being frugal, for living simply, and for not joining in the games of showing off. But John's mind was elsewhere, focused on what really mattered. He understood that short-term attention and social validation were fleeting. True results, however, had a way of lasting and making their presence felt when the time was right. One day, a few colleagues tried to get him to share his progress. They were curious, but also skeptical. "Come on, John, tell us what you've done so far," one of them said, laughing. "You probably don't even have enough to brag about." John smiled politely and shook his head. "I'm happy with my plan," he said quietly. "We'll see how it goes." His calm response only made them laugh harder. They couldn't understand why someone would participate without showing off, and that laughter echoed through the office. Unaware of the quiet power it was dismissing, as the months went on, the office became increasingly divided. There were those who chased excitement and attention, constantly trying to outdo each other in flashy ways. Then there was John, silent and focused, methodical in his approach, and disciplined in his execution. People started noticing small things, how his projects were always completed flawlessly, how he seemed unshaken by setbacks, how he had a calm confidence that no one else could match. But still the laughter continued. They had not yet seen the results that would change their perception entirely, even outside work. John's habits reflected the same consistency. While colleagues spent weekends indulging in expensive trips, dining out, or chasing fleeting pleasures, John spent his time reading, researching, and planning. He occasionally met with close friends who appreciated his approach. Discussing strategies and sharing ideas for long-term growth, these conversations fueled his motivation and gave him a sense of community with like-minded people, far different from the competitive and often shallow environment at work. John's approach also taught him patience and humility. He didn't rush, he didn't complain, and he didn't react to the laughter or skepticism around him. Each decision he made was deliberate, thought out, and guided by logic rather than emotion. While others celebrated small, temporary wins, John was planting seeds for a future harvest that would far exceed anything they imagined. The competition, while designed to encourage everyone to improve, also revealed the stark differences in mindset. John's colleagues were focused on appearances and instant results, often ignoring the risks of their choices. John focused on reality, on careful calculations, and on steady growth. They laughed at his slow progress, unaware that he was quietly setting the stage for a moment that would completely change how they saw him. As the final months of the competition approached, whispers began to circulate. Some employees wondered if John had done anything at all. Others, noticing his calm confidence and consistent work ethic, started to suspect that perhaps he was ahead in ways they didn't understand. But no one dared to ask directly, fearing an answer that might challenge their assumptions. John, meanwhile, continued as usual. He reviewed his numbers nightly, adjusted his strategies, and maintained his disciplined routine. There was no rush, no pressure, no need to prove anything yet. He knew the results would speak for themselves when the time was right. By now, the office had become a mix of chaos, excitement, and anticipation. Some employees were worried about their own positions, realizing that their flashy methods had not yielded the results they had hoped for. Others were still laughing, confident that John's quiet approach could never surpass their daring, attention-seeking strategies. Little did they know, John had consistently applied principles that were far more powerful than showy investments or loud bragging, even during the day-to-day interactions. John's quiet strength became evident. When problems arose, he approached them logically and efficiently. When colleagues panicked over minor losses, he remained calm, assessing the situation carefully. Slowly, the contrast between him and the rest of the office grew more apparent. But still, they laughed at him, blind to the fact that the real story was unfolding quietly. Behind the scenes in his careful, deliberate actions, John's life, both inside and outside the office, continued in this rhythm. His savings and investments grew steadily, unnoticed by most. His simple lifestyle, disciplined habits, and patient approach positioned him perfectly for the moment when the competition would finally reveal who had truly succeeded. And while his colleagues laughed, mocked, and boasted, John simply focused on what mattered: steady progress, long-term growth, and personal satisfaction. He understood something most people didn't. The loudest voices often achieve the least, and those who work quietly and wisely are the ones who eventually surprise the world. And as the months passed, John continued quietly, steadily, and confidently, preparing for the moment when the account balance would finally speak louder than any laugh or insult in the office. The months of quiet preparation were finally coming to a head. The company had announced that the day of the final reveal for the savings and investment competition was approaching. The office buzzed with excitement, gossip, and anticipation. People were talking openly about who they thought would win. Most assumed it would be one of the flashy, confident employees who had loudly boasted about their strategies from the start. The quiet ones, especially John, were barely mentioned. Most of the office still assumed that someone so modest and unassuming could never have made much progress. As the day drew closer, curiosity about John began to grow quietly among some employees. A few of the more observant colleagues had noticed his calm confidence, his methodical approach to tasks, and the way he always seemed to handle challenges without stress. They started to wonder if perhaps John had done something more than anyone realized. But the louder, more confident voices in the office continued to dominate the conversation. They laughed at the idea that John, the quiet man with an old phone and simple clothes, could possibly compete with their flashy strategies. John, of course, remained entirely unaffected by the chatter. His focus was not on recognition or approval, but on completing the plan he had started months ago. Every day he continued his careful routine, reviewing his accounts, adjusting his strategies, and staying disciplined. He knew that the work he had done quietly, month after month, would eventually pay off. And he also knew that trying to explain or justify it to others before the time was right would achieve nothing. The week before the reveal, the office was filled with tension and nervous excitement. Some employees were double-checking their accounts, worried about small losses or unexpected changes in the market. Others were bragging openly, confident that their flashy tactics had worked. Lunch breaks were louder than ever, with employees discussing strategies, joking about who was winning, and mocking anyone who hadn't been vocal about their progress. John sat quietly at his desk during these conversations, occasionally nodding politely, but he remained focused on his own calculations. A few colleagues tried to pry into John's progress, genuinely curious, but also skeptical. "Come on, John, tell us. At least a little," one said, laughing nervously. "We won't laugh much." John smiled calmly. "I'm happy to share the results when the time comes," he said simply. His calm answer only fueled the curiosity and skepticism around him. Some people shook their heads, thinking he was hiding something trivial, while others felt a strange sense of unease, as if they were missing an important piece of the puzzle. At home, John's evenings were filled with quiet reflection and final adjustments. He went over every detail of his accounts, making sure that everything was accurate and properly organized. He checked his calculations multiple times, not because he doubted himself, but because he valued precision and clarity. Each night, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that all of his careful, disciplined work was ready for the moment of truth. The thought of the reveal filled him not with anxiety, but with a calm anticipation. Meanwhile, the office continued to speculate about the outcome. Some employees were growing nervous. A few of the risk-takers had already experienced minor setbacks, losing small amounts due to their impulsive decisions. They tried to ignore it, hoping that the attention on others would distract from their mistakes. The more methodical, strategic employees were confident but still wary. They had underestimated John for months, and now, with the reveal approaching, he could sense that something unexpected might happen. The day before the reveal, the office was unusually quiet. Employees were busy preparing their charts, reports, and presentations. Some were anxious, checking their numbers repeatedly. The loudest and most confident ones tried to keep their composure, joking and laughing as usual, but the tension was evident. John, however, was calm. He didn't need charts, flashy graphs, or elaborate presentations. He simply had his notebook and his carefully calculated account balance, ready to show when the time was right. His focus was steady, and his mind was clear. When the morning of the reveal finally arrived, the atmosphere in the office was electric. Employees gathered in the conference room, some whispering, others boasting, and a few secretly curious about John. The management explained the process, and the participants began to take turns presenting their results. The first few presentations were as expected: flashy graphs, colorful charts, and confident explanations. The room erupted in applause for the obvious leaders, while those with smaller gains tried to laugh it off. It was all loud, impressive, and somewhat chaotic. Then it was John's turn. The room quieted almost instinctively. People looked at him with curiosity, some smirking, others genuinely unsure of what to expect. John walked calmly to the front, carrying only his notebook. There were no flashy slides, no dramatic graphs, and no overconfident gestures. He simply smiled, greeted the room politely, and opened his notebook. "I'll just show the numbers as they are," he said in a calm, steady voice. The room fell silent. Everyone assumed his results would be small, modest, and unimpressive. Some people even started whispering jokes, expecting to laugh again at John's simplicity. But as he revealed the numbers, the laughter died instantly. The figures on the page were astonishing. Month by month, John had built a balance far greater than anyone else in the room. Every colleague who had boasted about their flashy investments, risky strategies, and daring purchases was suddenly quiet. Staring in disbelief, people began to murmur, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. How is this possible?" someone whispered. Others shook their heads, convinced that there must be a mistake. John remained calm, explaining each step briefly, showing how his consistent, careful approach had led to steady, compounding growth. There were no gimmicks, no tricks, just months of quiet discipline and smart decision-making. The contrast between John and his colleagues could not have been more clear. Those who had laughed at him for his modesty, his frugality, and his quiet demeanor were now speechless. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that true success does not always shout or demand attention. Sometimes it works quietly, patiently, and persistently, until the results cannot be ignored. Some employees tried to rationalize it. "He must have inherited money, or gotten lucky," one whispered. But those who had worked closely with John knew better. They had seen his disciplined routine, his careful planning, and his consistent efforts over months. Luck had little to do with it. John had simply done what most people were unwilling or unable to do: work steadily, patiently, and wisely, without seeking attention or approval. By the time John finished, the entire room was quiet except for a few gasps of astonishment. His colleagues, who had been so loud, confident, and mocking for months now, looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The room had shifted. Laughter had completely vanished, replaced by respect, curiosity, and even a touch of embarrassment for those who had doubted him. John simply smiled politely and returned to his seat, calm and composed as always. After the reveal, conversations in the office changed dramatically. People no longer laughed at John. Some approached him to ask questions, genuinely wanting to learn his strategies. Others simply stared in silent admiration, realizing that they had misjudged him for months. John answered patiently, sharing insights in simple, understandable terms, but he never boasted. He had no need to. His work had spoken louder than any words, louder than any laughter, and louder than any attempt to mock him. By the end of the day, John had not only won the competition, but had completely transformed the way his colleagues viewed him. The quiet man who had been underestimated, ignored, and laughed at was now seen as someone to respect and learn from. The lesson was clear. Appearances can be deceiving, and true achievement often comes quietly, patiently, and deliberately, waiting for the right moment to make itself known, even in the days that followed. The impact of John's results continued to resonate in the office. People adjusted their behavior, paying more attention to their work rather than appearances. Some tried to emulate John's approach, realizing that consistent effort and careful planning could outperform loudness and showiness. And John, as always, remained humble, continuing his disciplined routine, not for recognition, but because he valued steady progress and long-term growth. Above all else, the reveal had not only proven Tease's financial skill, but it also taught the office a deeper lesson about patience, humility, and perseverance. Those who had mocked him learned that laughter and judgment are often misplaced. Quiet diligence can lead to extraordinary results. John's story, which had unfolded quietly over months, had finally become impossible to ignore. The man who had been laughed at the most had shown that true success does not need applause, it only needs consistency, wisdom, and time. And so, the office that had once laughed at John learned a lesson they would not forget. The quiet, underestimated employee had not only won the competition, but had also changed the way everyone thought about effort, discipline, and achievement. For John, the day was not about glory or praise. It was simply the moment when his quiet work finally revealed its power, a moment that spoke for itself. Louder than any words, louder than any laughter, and louder than anyone could have imagined. The day after the reveal, the office was completely different. People could hardly stop talking about John's account balance. Even those who had not been present at the meeting came over to colleagues, asking in disbelief, "Did you see what John did?" The laughter that had once echoed through the hallways had vanished. In its place was a mixture of curiosity, respect, and a little embarrassment. People were realizing, slowly but surely, that the quiet, unassuming man they had underestimated had accomplished something extraordinary. John, as always, was calm. He noticed the change but did not gloat. He knew the results were not about him. They were about discipline, patience, and the value of steady effort. People continued to approach him, some politely, others with wide-eyed amazement, asking questions about how he had achieved such a result. John explained simply, without exaggeration, without showing off, detailing his careful planning, consistent saving, and smart investments. His approach was practical, understandable, and surprisingly simple. People listened, realizing that the secret had never been flashy or complicated. It was just steady, intelligent work done over time, some of the office's loudest voices. The ones who had mocked John for months now struggled with embarrassment. They had laughed at his old phone, his simple meals, his quiet habits, and his thriftiness. Now, they realized that every joke had been misplaced. Some tried to make excuses. "Well, maybe he got lucky," one whispered to a colleague, shaking his head in disbelief. But those who had worked with John or observed him closely knew better. Luck had nothing to do with it. John had achieved this entirely through his discipline, focus, and patience, qualities many of his colleagues had overlooked or dismissed in the days that followed. John's results continued to ripple through the office. The management was impressed not just by the numbers, but by what they represented: consistency, intelligence, and foresight. They praised John quietly in meetings, and although he accepted the compliments politely, he never made a show of them. To John, the recognition was secondary. He had never been motivated by praise or attention. The satisfaction came from knowing that he had accomplished what he set out to do. Conversations among employees shifted dramatically. People who had once mocked him now listened intently when he spoke. Some were hesitant at first, still struggling to reconcile their previous assumptions with the reality in front of them. Others approached him directly, asking for guidance on savings, budgeting, and investing. John shared his knowledge patiently, without judgment, explaining strategies in simple, clear terms. He never scolded or reminded anyone of the laughter they had shared at his expense. He simply helped those willing to learn, quietly passing on the lessons that had taken him months of consistent effort to master. The contrast between John and his colleagues became even more apparent. Many of them had made impulsive decisions, chasing trends, flashy investments, and instant gratification. While they had celebrated temporary gains, they had also suffered losses. John's steady approach, by contrast, had ensured long-term growth, stable results, and financial security. It was a lesson that many employees found difficult to accept at first, especially those who had been loudest in their skepticism. The numbers spoke for themselves, leaving little room for argument. Even casual interactions in the office had changed. People no longer dismissed John's opinions during meetings. They began to pay attention when he spoke, recognizing that his quiet demeanor had never been a sign of weakness. Some colleagues admitted privately to feeling foolish for underestimating him. Others were inspired to take their own finances more seriously, realizing that patience and consistent effort could achieve more than flashy, short-term moves ever could. John's influence, previously invisible, was now quietly reshaping the culture of the office. Outside work, John's life continued as usual. He still lived simply, cooked his own meals, and spent evenings reviewing accounts and planning for the future. There was no sudden change in his habits or lifestyle. He did not start showing off or buying expensive items. His satisfaction came not from external recognition, but from the knowledge that his consistent, careful approach had produced extraordinary results. This quiet contentment only added to the respect people felt for him, as they saw that true success could be humble, deliberate, and self-sustained. Over time, some of the office's most skeptical employees began to adopt small parts of John's approach. They started budgeting more carefully, tracking their own expenses, and reconsidering impulsive investments. The influence of John's results was subtle but significant. People who had once laughed at him were now learning from him, quietly transforming their own habits in ways that reflected his disciplined example. John never pressured anyone. He simply provided guidance when asked. The impact was far-reaching. Even the management took note of John's calm effectiveness. They began to view him not just as a successful participant in a competition, but as someone whose approach could benefit the company as a whole. They asked him to share tips during meetings, and although John continued to maintain his humble demeanor, his advice was listened to with respect and consideration. The office, which had once dismissed him as quiet and unremarkable, now looked to him as a source of wisdom and steady guidance. The story of John's achievement also began to spread beyond the office walls. Colleagues told friends and family about the quiet man whose account balance had shocked everyone. They spoke of his careful planning, discipline, and patience, highlighting the contrast between his modest lifestyle and his remarkable results. John never sought this attention, but he accepted it quietly, knowing that the real lesson lay not in fame or praise, but in the principles that had guided him to success. Even months after the reveal, the office still remembered the moment when John had presented his account balance. It was a moment that redefined their understanding of effort, patience, and intelligence. People who had once laughed now told new employees the story as a lesson in humility and perseverance. John's approach became a silent model for the office, demonstrating that consistent, intelligent effort often achieves far more than noise, bravado, or impulsive decisions. John himself remained unchanged in his demeanor and lifestyle. He continued his quiet routine, waking early, reviewing accounts, planning next steps, and maintaining his simple, organized life. There were no sudden displays of wealth, no attempts to prove superiority, no desire for recognition. To John, the results were proof enough, and they were satisfying in ways that external praise could never match. His calm confidence became a source of inspiration, showing others that success does not need to be loud to be extraordinary. The office, which had once been filled with laughter and mockery at John's expense, had transformed. Respect, curiosity, and admiration had replaced the derision that had once dominated. People no longer judged each other by appearances or fleeting gestures. They began to understand that steady effort, careful planning, patient work could achieve results far beyond what impulsive or flashy strategies could deliver. John's quiet example became a lasting lesson, a reminder that true success often works silently, only revealing itself when the time is right. Even the employees who had been most vocal in their ridicule learned valuable lessons. They realized that laughter and mockery do not determine competence or success. Judging others based on appearances is often misguided. True ability is revealed in results, in consistent effort, and in the choices people make quietly every day. John's success was living proof that these principles worked, and the office would not forget the lesson in the weeks and months that followed. John continued to support his colleagues quietly. He offered advice, guidance, and tips whenever asked, always with patience and humility. He never sought to dominate conversations or show off his achievements. His influence was subtle but enduring, shaping habits, perspectives, and attitudes in ways that would last far longer than the excitement of the competition. The quiet man who had once been laughed at had become an example of wisdom, patience, and disciplined success. By the end of the year, John's achievement was celebrated not only for the numbers, but for the lesson it had taught. The office had learned that appearances can be deceiving, that loud voices do not always equate to competence, and that patience, discipline, steady effort are often the most powerful tools for success. John's story became a quiet legend in the office, shared again and again as a source of inspiration and a reminder that true accomplishment often arrives in silence, unseen until it cannot be ignored. And so, life continued, with John maintaining his steady routine, his calm confidence, and his humble lifestyle. The office, transformed by the lesson he had provided, now looked at quiet diligence in a new light. People approached their own work with more care, listened more attentively, and understood that true results often require patience and consistency rather than noise and showiness. John's quiet victory had left a lasting mark, proving that real success is not measured by the laughter it attracts, but by the strength and wisdom it reflects. Months had passed since the big reveal, and life at the office had changed in ways no one could have anticipated. The quiet man, who had once been overlooked, laughed at, and underestimated, had left a lasting impression that went far beyond a single competition. John's calm and disciplined approach had become a quiet force that influenced everyone around him. His story was no longer just about money. It had become about patience, discipline, the power of consistent effort. Colleagues who had once mocked John now approached him with genuine curiosity. Some wanted advice on managing their finances, while others sought guidance on improving their work habits and personal discipline. John, as always, responded with quiet patience. He never boasted or made anyone feel small. Instead, he shared his experience in simple, practical ways. He explained how small, consistent actions taken over time could produce results far greater than flashy or impulsive moves. People listened attentively, often amazed at how logical and straightforward his approach was. The office culture had shifted. The constant competition for attention, the loud boasts, and the short-term thinking that had dominated conversations before were slowly giving way to a more thoughtful, deliberate mindset. Employees began to focus on their work with greater care, analyzing their decisions and considering the long-term consequences rather than chasing immediate recognition. John's example had sparked this change without a single word of judgment or criticism. His quiet influence proved more powerful than any lecture or directive. Even those who had been most vocal in ridiculing him felt the impact. Some were embarrassed when they realized how little they had accomplished compared to John. But their embarrassment soon turned into motivation. They started to observe his methods, take notes, and apply his principles to their own work and finances. The laughter that had once defined the office culture became a distant memory, replaced by a newfound respect for thoughtful planning and consistent effort. John's influence extended beyond just finances and productivity. He had also inspired his colleagues to reconsider their personal habits and choices. People began to plan more carefully, save more consistently, and think more strategically about their goals. Even small actions, like organizing their workspaces, managing their time better, or keeping track of expenses, were suddenly done with intention. John's quiet example had shown them that small, consistent improvements could lead to substantial and lasting results. The management noticed the change too. They saw that employees were working more efficiently, making smarter decisions, and collaborating more effectively. Productivity had increased, mistakes had decreased, and morale had improved. They realized that John's quiet influence had created a ripple effect, benefiting not just individuals but the entire company. They started inviting him to share his methods in a structured way, not to showcase him, but to help others learn and grow. John agreed, of course, but he continued to present his ideas in a calm, humble manner, focusing on practical advice rather than recognition. At home, John continued to live as he always had. His apartment remained simple and organized, his meals homemade, and his evenings filled with reflection and planning. There was no change in his lifestyle, no sudden indulgence in luxury, and no desire for attention. The satisfaction he felt came from the knowledge that he had stayed true to his principles, worked diligently, and achieved results through discipline and patience. For John, that quiet pride was far more meaningful than any external applause. Some colleagues who had once been dismissive of John now sought his mentorship in more serious ways. They asked him to help them set financial goals, create savings plans, and establish routines that would lead to long-term success. John guided them gently, explaining the importance of consistency, patience, and careful planning. He emphasized that there were no shortcuts to meaningful success, and that the small choices made every day ultimately determined the outcome. People who followed his guidance soon began to see improvements in their own lives, and the cycle of learning and growth continued. The ripple effect of John's approach extended beyond the office walls. Friends and family of his colleagues started hearing about his methods, and some began to adopt similar habits in their own lives. Simple practices like saving regularly, tracking expenses, and thinking long-term became more common. John's quiet discipline had become an unexpected source of inspiration for many, proving that consistent effort, patience, and humility could have a far-reaching impact. John himself never sought to take credit for these changes. He was not interested in fame, recognition, or praise. His focus remained on his own work, maintaining his habits and helping others when asked. Yet, despite his humility, the lessons he taught were unforgettable. His colleagues learned that success is rarely loud or flashy. It often comes quietly through careful planning, steady effort, and unwavering patience. When results finally appear, they speak for themselves, leaving no room for doubt, even as the company moved forward with new projects, challenges, and goals. The memory of John's achievement continued to influence decisions. Employees became more thoughtful, more strategic, and more mindful of their actions. They realized that short-term gains and instant recognition were often fleeting, while long-term planning, discipline, and consistency produced results that lasted. John's example had subtly transformed the office culture. The lessons learned would remain long after the competition was over. John's own satisfaction was quiet but deep. He did not measure success by the reactions of others, but by the results of his own actions. He had proven, not to anyone else, but to himself, that a disciplined approach could achieve remarkable outcomes. He had stayed true to his values, ignored the distractions of mockery and judgment, and allowed his work to speak for itself. That quiet confidence, born from months of steady effort, was more rewarding than any external validation could ever be, even in casual conversations. John's colleagues would now refer to his achievement. New employees were told the story, not as gossip or entertainment, but as a lesson in humility, patience, and consistency. Pay attention to what John does, they were told. Don't just look at appearances. True success often works quietly, and when it shows up, it's undeniable. John never sought to be the hero of the story. He was simply a living example of principles that anyone could apply if they chose to, as months turned into a year. John's approach continued to influence more people. Some employees who had once been skeptical became mentors themselves, teaching small lessons learned from observing John. others adopted his financial habits. Learning the value of consistent saving and thoughtful investment, the ripple effect spread far beyond the initial competition, touching lives in subtle, meaningful ways. John's quiet success had grown into a lasting example of what can be achieved through patience, focus, and discipline. John continued to live modestly, work diligently, and focus on long-term growth. He never let pride or ego influence his actions. His quiet routine, calm demeanor, and careful planning became a source of inspiration for those who sought guidance. People realized that it was not just about the numbers in his account balance, it was about the mindset, the habits, and the principles that created those numbers. The lesson was clear, consistent, intelligent effort, combined with patience and humility, can lead to extraordinary results. The office that had once laughed at John had transformed in more ways than one. People had learned to respect quiet diligence, to value careful planning, and to recognize that appearances can be deceiving. John's story was repeated, remembered, and shared, not as a tale of wealth, but as a testament to the power of perseverance, discipline, and steady effort. It was a story that would inspire others for years to come. John himself never sought the spotlight. He continued to live simply, maintain his routines, and help others quietly. But the impact of his achievement could not be ignored. He had shown that true success is often invisible at first, working quietly behind the scenes until it becomes impossible to overlook. The laughter that had once greeted him had been replaced with respect, curiosity, and admiration. The lesson was universal. When you focus on what truly matters, ignore distractions, and work patiently and intelligently, success will find its way to you. Even beyond the office, John's story had a quiet reach. Friends, family, and acquaintances who heard of his achievement were inspired to rethink their own approach to work, finances, and life. They realized that small, consistent steps often lead to results far greater than impulsive actions or flashy displays. John's method was simple, but its power lay in its consistency and discipline. The principles he followed were timeless, applicable to anyone willing to commit to them. In the end, John's achievement was about more than winning a competition. It was about showing that patience, humility, and consistent effort are often more powerful than talent, confidence, or appearances. It was about proving that true success does not need attention, applause, or validation. It simply requires focus, intelligence, and steady action. The man who had been laughed at most had become a quiet example of wisdom, demonstrating that true results speak louder than words, louder than mockery, and louder than any fleeting trend. John's story had reached a conclusion, but its impact continued to grow. The office had been changed. Colleagues had learned valuable lessons, and the principles he had demonstrated spread far beyond the walls of the company. John's quiet diligence had shown that real success is earned patiently, nurtured consistently, and revealed inevitably. The man who had been underestimated, overlooked, and mocked had become a living example of the truth. The results you build with care. Patience and intelligence cannot be denied. And so, life continued. John maintained his quiet habits, simple lifestyle, and calm focus. The office continued to thrive, influenced by his example. People remembered the lesson he had taught, that laughter and mockery often hide ignorance. Quiet diligence often hides extraordinary results. John had not sought recognition, but he had earned something far more lasting: respect, inspiration, and the knowledge that the principles he had lived by could change not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him.